Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to another episode of Heal with KP. Thank you all so much for joining me for this episode and also for this new series that I am releasing. I am your host, Kateria Poe. I'm a mental health therapist. I've been in the field for a little over 11 years now. I am a motor vehicle accident trauma survivor. I am a healing advocate. I am a Christian counselor, a mother, a sister, an auntie, a friend. I am all of those things. And so the first thing that I want you all just to know about me is that healing is not something that I chose to talk about. It's actually not even something that I thought would be within my path just to discuss them with you all even today. I will say back in 2015, my life changed drastically after I was involved in a head-on car accident. And by the grace of God, I was able to heal not only physically, but also emotionally and spiritually at that time, just to a lot of things that I wasn't even aware of that was going on. I'll also say that while that was a reintroduction to healing for me, and it really just overall ignited my faith walk back to Christ, and I'm doing it in a way that it was legit this time. I've also realized that healing has been just such a huge part of my life, even from the time that I was younger, and so there are just so many things that I want to share. But when you see me post about healing, when you see me talk about healing all the time with a big smile on my face, just know that it's not something that I necessarily chose to do, but I feel that this was a topic that was assigned to me. I feel like this is something that kind of chose me. And I also just want to make sure that I'm being faithful and talking about it to all who will listen. Okay. And so today I really want to set the stage for a journey into emotional healing and what that means. For me, emotional healing is the foundation to the well-being of our minds and our spirits. I think it's so many material, is so much information on the internet now about physical health. And so I will encourage you all to go and do that research. But what I want to be able to provide is just my expertise on the emotional side and the spiritual side, which I think is so interconnected, that can sometimes prevent us from getting to the physical stuff. And so this episode, again, I just want to focus on emotional healing. And this will be the intro to the overall series, which is Healing 101, an intro to emotional healing. So let's go ahead and dive into what emotional healing actually is. Emotional healing is a process of acknowledging, understanding, and transforming emotional pain into a state of well-being. Again, that is the process of acknowledging, understanding, and transforming emotional pain into a state of well-being. Unlike our physical health or physical healing, which involves visible wounds and a predictable recovery time, emotional healing deals with invisible scars that are left by our experience, relationships, and also our internal battles. It is so crucial for us to make sure that we can get a grip on our emotional healing because when these things go unresolved, it really creates a cycle of emotional pain, and it really can impact every aspect of our life, from our mental health, our physical health, and on to our relationships and daily functioning. And so one of the things that I've noticed over the course of just being a therapist is that a lot of times people have emotional wounds and they are not aware of them until something triggers it, right? Whether it is a coworker, a new relationship, a comment from a parent, those things can trigger our emotional wounds and really shed light on things that have been there all along. So let's move on to talking about understanding our emotions and their impact. And so let's start with a basic understanding of emotions. Emotions are complex reactions that involve both a physiological and a psychological response to different stimuli. They are a fundamental part of our human experience, including our thoughts, our behaviors, and our interactions with other people. For most of us, from a young age, we experience things that shape the way we see life and the way that we identify our emotions. For example, if a child grows up in a nurturing, loving environment, they might be able to learn to express their emotions in a healthy way. But if that child grew up in a chaotic or abusive environment, it's more likely that that person is going to struggle with emotional regulation. For most of us, our family members are the first people that help us to identify emotions, good and bad, right? So the first time that we are probably identifying if we're good at something, it might be from a family member or loved ones pointing out, oh, you can sing or you can dance, so you're a good cook. And those things can give us positive feelings. It can give us feelings of joy. It can give us feelings of satisfaction, right? But if our family introduces us to feelings such as guilt and shame, right? If our family is the first people that put us down or the people who bully us in a sense, right? Then oftentimes what we expect from others can be a little skewed based off of how our family laid that foundation for us. As we continue to grow and mature, those early childhood experiences can really lead to deeply ingrained emotional patterns and deeply ingrained emotional wounds in us. And so it's so important for us to make sure that we are taking the time out to identify those emotional wounds that are invisible, that we walk around with, we might be carrying every day, and we're not aware of them until we're triggered by someone or something. One of the tools that I like to use in therapy to help people identify and challenge those patterns is cognitive behavioral therapy. And if you haven't heard of cognitive behavioral therapy before, I do have a video on my page that talks about cognitive behavioral therapy and breaks it down a little more so that you can understand. Cognitive behavioral therapy talks about the connections between our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. So what we think, what we feel, and what we do. And it really helps us to hold ourselves accountable as we're learning to heal and as we're just going throughout life. And so cognitive behavioral therapy is useful because it can help us identify and change those patterns that are unhealthy. So similarly, as believers, our biblical teachings provide a foundation and understanding for transforming our emotions through faith. And so again, our physical, mental, and spiritual health is very important. But as I focus on the emotional and spiritual side, those two can often be a hindrance to our physical health, our physical progress. And so I just want to make sure that we're paying special attention to those two. There are so many different emotions. And so there is also an emotions wheel that I often use in therapy. I'll try to link one of those two so you all can just go back and list it. But for the sake of this podcast and being on limited time, and I do want to focus on just the common emotions and their impact, that will be anger, fear, sadness, and guilt, right? And so anger, we know, can be a powerful emotion that often masks our deeper feelings of hurt and fear. It can also lead to very destructive behavior if we don't manage it properly. Fear is another one. Fear can be paralyzing, and fear can prevent us from taking necessary steps in our lives to move forward and actually become the people that we know we have the ability to become. Back when I was in college, I had a professor that brought to my attention the acronym of fear and how to manage it. And she said fear, F-E-A-R, the acronym is false evidence appearing real. And that was something that stuck with me. False evidence appearing real. And so fear can be paralyzing. Fear can stop us from doing things. We can come up with so many excuses and so many reasons why we shouldn't do something. But oftentimes it's false evidence that we give, that we push at ourselves, and it appears real, and so we don't do that thing. Sadness is another common emotion that comes up, and it is something that can be rooted in our childhood as well. And so sadness is a natural response to loss, a natural response to disappointment, but it can be very overwhelming if it's not addressed. And so again, if we're thinking back to childhood, if someone has a pattern of being disappointed, if someone has a pattern of loss, a lot of the times it can impact how they're able to form relationships, and even if they're able to form healthy relationships at all. Guilt is another one. Guilt can be a healthy emotion when it leads us to corrective action, but it can also be destructive when it lingers unnecessarily. And so now I want to go through all of those different emotions, but I really want to take some time and give an approach from cognitive behavioral therapy to manage each one of those emotions I just listed, and also give something that you all can apply to also manage that anger from a spiritual standpoint. Okay, so going back to anger, we know that anger can be a powerful emotion. And if you are listening to this, I'm sure you all have heard the term angry black woman, or just a stereotype, right, of women being categorized or as angry, or even a stereotype of black people in general being categorized as angry, and I think a lot of times for us, anger is one of those emotions that we freely see people express sometimes because it kind of masks us as powerful, or kind of masks sometimes as an emotion that is dominant. And so I don't think it's something that people are usually afraid to share. But what we know about anger to be true is that oftentimes it's deeper feelings of hurt, it's deeper feelings of fear that's really lying beneath that anger. And so we really want to make sure that we are doing the work to see what's lying just beneath that anger. And so if we're coming from the perspective of cognitive behavioral therapy, we want to make sure we can recognize and identify the underlying thoughts that lead to anger. The next thing we're going to want to do is challenge those thoughts and replace them with more constructive or helpful thoughts. If you're listening to this, it sounds like it's a simple process, right? Identify the trigger, challenge it, right? And replace it with a constructive one. But I will tell you, if you have ever tried to manage your anger in present day, right? Meaning someone or something has just upset or bothered you, right? The last thing that we're doing is thinking, right? We're probably doing, so cognitive behavioral therapy is really helpful because sometimes we don't get it right in the moment. And in fact, most people don't get it right in the moment because we're not thinking clearly. And so cognitive behavioral therapy is helpful because we want to go back to the last time someone made you mad. Go back to the last time something made you angry, right? What was the trigger? Were you thinking something? Was it something they said that triggered you to think about something? And what did you do? Working off an example is often helpful for us because it's easier for us to go back and trace our steps and to see what we could have done differently. And then that actually gives us tools for how we can respond the next time, right? If we're not applying a specific example, a lot of times it might not be personable enough so that we can actually take into account when to apply those different tools and techniques. And coming from a biblical perspective, we're reminded in Ephesians 4:26 to be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, right? So this verse is reminding us just to manage our anger in a timely manner. All right. And so one of the things I want to continue to reiterate as we're talking about emotions is that emotions themselves are not bad. Because a certain emotion is present is not a bad thing. And it's really not necessary for us to suppress our emotions. I believe that once we allow our emotions to breathe, once we allow them to kind of come to the surface and see the light, we're able to better deal with that emotion. I will add that while our emotions are not something that needs to be suppressed, our emotions also do not get to make decisions for us, and they do not get to override doing what is right or doing what is appropriate in that situation. The next emotion I'm going to talk about is fear. If you're listening to this, you're old enough to have a phone. I'm sure you've experienced fear, right? We know that fear can be paralyzing and it can prevent us from making necessary actions in our lives. From a cognitive behavioral therapy perspective, identifying irrational fears and challenging them can help us to move past it. One of the most complicated things, I think, for ourselves in moving through fear, right? Moving past fear is to learn to take a moment and identify if a fear is real or if it is irrational. And so one of the things that we have to do is to ask ourselves is this a real threat? Am I in immediate danger, Or do I feel attacked based off of what someone said or based off of what my emotions are telling me? From a biblical perspective, we have to make sure that we are able to replace fear with faith. And in fact, I believe that fear is the opposite of faith, right? Because if fear is something that paralyzes us and it stops us from taking actions in our life, faith, right? I'm sure you all have heard the term, take the leap of faith, right? Faith is the thing that helps to pull us forward, and is evidence of things that we can't see. And so when we are talking about fear, one, going back to the acronym that I got from my professor years ago, fear is false evidence appearing real. And we really have to make sure that we are addressing it as that so that it does not stop us from moving forward. And so it doesn't stop us from ultimately becoming the person that God has intended us to be. The next emotion I want to talk about is sadness. And sadness is a natural response to a loss or disappointment. But when we don't address that loss, when we don't address that disappointment, it can become overwhelming. One of the things that we have to be careful about increasing during sadness is our transparency. The majority of people that I sit with in session when they are sad, when they're feeling down, they don't tell anyone about it, right? And so that sadness oftentimes keeps us silent. It almost steals our voice sometimes. And so we really have to make sure that, one, we're breaking that silence and we're talking to someone about what we're thinking about. Having support, or even just saying things out loud sometimes, it allows us to challenge what we're feeling. Coming again from a cognitive behavioral therapy perspective, in order for us to address sadness, we have to not only engage in activities that bring us joy and fulfillment, but we have to make sure that we continue to be in community. Talk to people. Talk to the person that will listen, that will bring you joy, the person that will just allow you to be yourself and get those negative thoughts out of your head, right? So that you can actually challenge them. From a biblical perspective, we know that Psalms 34:18 reminds us that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And so again, back to just acknowledging our voice and making sure that we're identifying what we're feeling. If we're crushed in spirit, we have to make sure that we have someone else to lean on, right? So reach out to your friend, reach out to your mom, reach out to someone who can listen to you and help you during that time. And ultimately, we have to make sure that we're praying and just talking to God, who is the ultimate comforter during our times of sadness. The last emotion I want to talk about is guilt. And so earlier, I know I said guilt can be a healthy emotion, and you might disagree with that, but but hear me out, okay? And so I think a lot of times when we are experiencing guilt, it can be motivation to do something different, right? It can lead to corrective action. And so oftentimes for us as believers, we might say, oh, I felt convicted or I felt, unsure of what I should have been doing, And so one of the beautiful things about being a believer is that God will correct us. And so sometimes we experience guilt because God is correcting us. We are able to see what we did wrong. We're able to see maybe how we mismanaged something or mismanaged someone, and we're able to move forward with a corrective action. Coming from a CBT perspective, we have to make sure that we can understand the difference between a healthy guilt and a toxic guilt. One way that we can understand the difference between the two is by taking responsibility for our actions and also practicing self-forgiveness. When we're willing to take responsibility for our actions, it allows us to create a safe space of accountability, and we begin to build a blueprint based off of what we believe to be true and what we believe to be right. And so whenever we fall outside of those guidelines in which we have already identified as true and right, oftentimes we will experience guilt. Now, when we experience guilt and what we're doing, our actions, what we're saying align with what we believe to be true and what we believe to be right, then that could be a toxic form of guilt. So one of the ways that we can manage and help subside that toxic guilt is that when we experience that guilt and we already have identified that our actions were right and that we agree with it, is to then think about where that guilt is coming from. Is it from a specific person? Is it from a specific belief that you don't subscribe to? The quicker that we can identify the difference between whether a guilt is healthy and whether a guilt is toxic, we'll be able to quickly move forward and identify how we want to respond to it. And the truth is, if it is a guilt that is toxic, we really just have to make sure that we reiterate to ourselves that it's not something that we choose to subscribe to. Coming from a biblical perspective, we know that in 1 John 1:9, it states, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. We have to make sure that we are forgiving ourselves, and we have to seek God's forgiveness as well, right? Seek God's forgiveness and forgive yourself as a way to manage that guilt. I know I talked about that toxic guilt and what it can feel like. And oftentimes for us in our society, we are going to say things that people don't agree with. We are going to say things that people might misinterpret or that they are genuinely hurt by. But what we also have to remember is that we are not perfect, right? The goal is not to get and do and say everything right, because that can actually cause us to live under an amount of unrealistic pressure, and it doesn't end well. And so I will say a lot of the toxic guilt sometimes that we experience in this world is based off of other people's beliefs. And so at the end of the day, we have to make sure that when we feel that we're done wrong, that we're aligning that back to our faith and aligning that back to our beliefs, and if we are wrong, we have to give ourselves the right to be corrected. And if we feel like our actions are in line with our beliefs and with our faith, again, we have to make sure that we understand we're not going to be able to please everybody. We're not going to be able to make everybody happy, and that's okay. And so the next thing I like to do to provide a little bit more context just about emotional healing is answer some questions. And so the first question is, how does emotional healing differ from physical healing? So of course we know that one of the ways that physical and emotional healing, one of the ways that they're different is its visibility. And so if we're working to recover or heal from physical things, then we can see it. If we have a wound, if we have a cut or a scrape, it is something that's visible, and we can make sure we're applying a Band-Aid, a bandage, and or stitches if that's what's needed. And again, even in that example, depending on the depth of the wound or how big the wound is, the requirement even for the physical healing is going to be different things. Again, it could be a Band-Aid, it could be stitches, or it could be simply maybe just some ointment, right? If we're trying to heal that physical wound. When it comes to emotional wounds, these wounds are invisible. And so oftentimes these wounds manifest in different ways. So it could manifest as anxiety, depression, or unhealthy behaviors. And just like the different ways that physical wounds can be treated, we know that there are multiple ways that emotional wounds can be treated. And I'll also say emotional wounds are a little different because it takes multiple ways in treating one same wound. And so what that might look like for someone struggling with anxiety, it will require them managing it on their own and understanding it. It probably could also involve family members or friends helping to remind them of maybe when they're blowing things out of proportion. Even with that anxiety and learning to manage it, it could take going to therapy as well as memorizing quotes and scriptures to help manage that same thing. Because of the difference between physical and emotional healing, we know that emotional healing requires a much more personalized approach. And it also requires that we're able to self-reflect and make sure that we are open to trying the different routes, right? Whether it be counseling, whether it be having friends hold you accountable, and really applying that spiritual growth as well as mental health therapy. And so the next question is, can emotional healing be achieved without professional help? And so in short, I will say yes. Of course, we know that Professional help is not required for us to heal, but it is something that can reduce the amount of time that it takes us to get to the same destination. And so I like to use the analogy of GPS when I'm explaining this to my clients. Therapy, the end goal is to get you to that better version of yourself. If you're driving in a car and you're trying to get to a location, if you're somewhat familiar with the area and what you're looking for, you might be able to still find that destination without using GPS. But if you're in a place where you have never been before and you're working to navigate to a destination, whether it's a store or a gas station or whatever, but it is a place you have literally never been, it is going to take you a lot longer to find your destination. Therapy is not the only route of healing, but therapy is a way for you to have a GPS to get to your destination of healing a little bit faster, or the hopes is that you're able to get to that destination of healing a little faster. And so again, while that professional support can definitely facilitate and speed up the emotional healing process or make sure that you have a way of tracking it, it's not the only way for you to heal. It's not the only way for you to move forward. There are a lot of different ways that we can work to heal and encourage each other to heal. You know, the first thing that I encourage people to do is to have a solid support system. Make sure that you're journaling so that you can actually track your thoughts, so that you can track the challenges that you're facing, and you can actually track the battles that you've overcome, right? In a positive way. You can definitely increase your prayer life, increase your understanding, make sure that you're absorbing information online and actually implementing those changes. You know, all of these things that you can do without the help of therapy, but you are going to need that solid support system, and you are going to need some coping skills and someone to hold you accountable. So professional support provides structure, it provides techniques, and it gives a very objective perspective that is going to be harder for you to achieve on your own. One of the benefits of having friends, family, and support is that they do not replace the role of a therapist. And one of the benefits of having a therapist, as great as it is, right, it does not replace the role of family and friends and faith community, right? That is something that we need to have separate, and the two actually work together. And so my suggestion is to make sure that you have both. And if therapy is not something that you can afford right now, or that you're even open to, right, feedback would be to make sure that you have a way of holding yourself accountable, that you have a group of friends and or family that hold you accountable, and have a way of tracking your own progress. And so I know a lot of times people talk about journaling or maybe even keeping notes on their phones. And I'll encourage you really to have pen and paper when you're talking about tracking your emotional journey, because it is a different release that we get from putting pen to paper. One of the benefits also of having pen and paper and writing things out physically, the way that our thoughts work and operate, they can move so quickly. And so having that pen to paper, yes, it is old school, but it is also therapeutic because it slows down our thoughts. We can only write one word at a time. And so that automatically forces us to slow down and really think about what we're writing on that paper. Versus if someone were using their phone, the notes app, right, to process. I don't know what phones you all have, but when you have an iPhone and you're typing, or probably most phones, I'm assuming, not to hate on y'all Droid users, but sure, in your phone, to some extent, it picks up on how we speak, the common sentences that we use, and it'll start to fill it in for you. You know, so one of the downsides of technology is that as much as we're thinking, it encourages us to think even more, and it tries to predict what we're about to say. And so I always encourage people, when you're tracking your own emotional journey, when you're tracking your own healing, stick to pen and paper, because it is a release, whether you can see it or get irritated by it, how it slows down your process, that is needed. You know, so get that pen and paper when you're tracking those emotional changes and those emotional progress. And the next question I'll answer is, what are some common barriers to emotional healing? the common barriers to emotional healing vary, of course, from person to person. But I will say, based off of my experience over the past 11 years, these are some of the things that I've just run into that prevent people from healing emotionally. And I really want you all to hear this with sound judgment. I really want to make sure for you that you have nobody else in mind when I'm reading this list, but I want you to take time to reflect and really think about how you respond to these things, or if this is present or a thing for you, right? And so going off those common barriers of emotional healing, the first one I would say is denial. Refusing to acknowledge the pain can prevent the healing process from even starting. I see this so often when I'm attempting to work with people in the beginning. And while they might be open to therapy and open to the process, a lot of times there can be a lot of resistance because they're in denial with what they actually need help with, right? They might come in for one problem or one surface issue, and then later on we actually realize it's a root issue, right? That's causing multiple problems to surface, but the same root issue. We can only fix what we acknowledge, right? Or we can only work with what we're willing to acknowledge. And so the first thing in denial, a lot of people can refuse just to acknowledge the amount of pain that they're in. And we're all human. And so there's no shame in us just admitting and acknowledging that we are in pain and that we need help. So again, denial will be the first barrier. The second barrier would be the fear of vulnerability. The fear of vulnerability. Most people don't want to talk about their problems. Most people have a hard time opening up about their deepest hurts, opening up about the saddest parts of their lives, But therapy, healing, moving forward, it requires vulnerability. And so we really have to be willing to open up and identify what are the things that's hurting us? What are the things that hurt us the most in the past so that we can move past it? Next thing that I see very often in therapy is a lack of support. When we don't have a good support system, when we don't have a supportive network, family, friend group that we're operating out of, our journey of healing is so much more isolating and so much more overwhelming. Our friends and our family are there for us to literally do life with. And one of the things I also run into throughout the course of therapy is that people have support, right? They have people around them. They have people that they can count on, but they don't use them, right? So that even when we have support, if we're not opening up, if we're not vulnerable with that support, it's still not going to work in a way that it actually provides relief for us. And so again, that other barrier to emotional healing is that lack of support. And I also say not even allowing that support to show up. The next barrier to emotional healing is unresolved trauma. And so earlier I talked just a little bit about childhood obstacles, childhood things that come up that creates a pattern for us. And so we know that deep-seated trauma can be challenging to address without professional guidance. And so again, a lot of the things that I talked about before, as far as with healing emotionally and how it is possible to heal from those things without professional help, unresolved trauma is one that actually impacts the way that we see the world. I wear glasses, and if I put my glasses on and I notice it's a smudge or it's a streak or it's fingerprints on it, I immediately have to take them off and clean it, right? Because it's affecting the way that I'm seeing everything else in front of me, right? And it's also making whatever fingerprint or whatever scratch on it, right? It looks a lot bigger because it's on my glasses. It's on my lens, right? My glasses lens. And so unresolved trauma is like a pair of glasses that you're putting on that's foggy, that has scratches, that has dried up paint. It just has a lot of mess on it, and it impacts the way that you see the world. And so that unresolved trauma is a very difficult one, a very difficult route for you to heal on your own, because it is harder to challenge our unhealthy thoughts when we don't know the difference between the healthy and the unhealthy thoughts. And so that unresolved trauma is definitely one that can be a barrier to emotional healing. And the last one is negative thought patterns. And so persistent negative thinking can keep us trapped in a cycle of pain and prevent us from making progress. Healing requires that self-introspection. It requires that we're able to self-reflect. It requires that we're able to challenge our negative thoughts. If we're not able to do that or comprehend how to do that successfully, then a lot of times we're not able to make progress. We're not able to move forward because we don't have the tools that we need to address those. And so those common barriers, again, are denial, fear of vulnerability, lack of support, unresolved trauma, and negative thought patterns. And so lastly, in this intro to healing, I want to make sure I address how can we begin the healing process? I know that before I've talked about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and what that is, what it looks like. We've talked about some emotions and the different ones that commonly can trip us up. And also I've discussed some of the barriers to that emotional healing. And so I want to make sure that I'm leaving with giving you all some tips on how do we even begin? The whole point of this podcast, the whole point of my YouTube page is to make sure that people have access to tools and also that I'm able just to normalize some of the same conversations that I'm having every day in session. What I'm saying to you, it might not be new, but it might be something that you needed to hear again that you have not implemented, meaning you haven't put it into practice yet. First thing that we need to do to begin that healing process is to be able to self-reflect. If you're listening to this, I encourage you to jot these 4 things down. Take time to reflect on your emotions and the root causes. Journaling can be a helpful tool for this. A lot of the times when we are experiencing emotions over and over, we might not even be aware of the root cause. When I say understanding the root cause, we might not even understand how it's connected. And so a lot of the times, again, if someone's experiencing anger, once we begin to trace that anger, what's the situation? Who made you upset? What did you do about it? Right? As we begin to track those things, 9 times out of 10, we're going to see some patterns or similarities in to how you're responding to anger or who's causing you, what is causing you to be angry. And so when we take time to reflect on our emotions and journal about it, we're creating a blueprint, right? We're creating a log so that we can begin to trace and track. Journaling specifically for our thoughts, specifically for our triggers, is needed so that we can begin that healing process. The next thing I would say in beginning the healing process is to begin challenging your negative thoughts. First thing we have to start doing is challenging those negative thoughts. Just because a thought popped up in your head, it does not mean that you have to entertain it, and it does not mean that it is true. One of the main challenges that people face in their healing process is separating the negative thoughts, the unhelpful thoughts, from the positive thoughts, or the ones that actually help to pull us forward. And so as believers, we know that all throughout Scripture, we have commandments, right? Or things that can help us in moving forward, right? Because Scripture helps propel us forward. I'm sure you all are familiar with 2 Corinthians 10:5, when it says, take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. When it comes to challenging negative thoughts, our faith is so important and it is so useful because we have to be mindful of our fleshly nature. We have to be mindful of our thoughts that pop up that are not good. It doesn't mean that we ourselves are not good, but our thoughts are not good. And so we have to make sure that we're taking those thoughts captive and making them obedient to Christ, making them obedient to the truth. One way I like to encourage people to challenge those negative thoughts is to find the truth, right? And separate the truth from the lies. The next thing that we can do in beginning the healing process is to seek support. We already know about therapy and its outlet, and yes, that is a route of professional support. There are also support groups. If you cannot afford one-on-one therapy, there are support groups around specific topics that might be helpful for you. So if you're a member of a church, they have counselors, they have pastors, they have church leaders that can help you process through things. someone that you trust, someone that is possibly along their healing journey also. This is not something that you have to do alone. Oftentimes, by the time people get to therapy, they're so burned out from trying to heal and do life alone that they've made themselves their own enemies, right? They're highly critical of themselves. Make sure you have someone that you are talking to. And if you don't have anyone that you feel like is on the same page, don't be afraid to make new friends. The last point that I would suggest as far as how to begin the healing process is prayer and meditation. I also know many people who have found a lot of help in journaling their prayers. When we incorporate prayer, when we incorporate meditation into our daily routine, it allows us to find peace, it allows us to find guidance, and it allows us simply to slow down long enough just to be still. Stillness is so important for us along our healing journey because we live in a society where we are constantly bombarded with information, advertisements. There are just always things being thrown at us. And so a lot of the times we're like almost backed up on our emotional and spiritual responses to things. So it's so important for us just to have that time to be still and begin to assess what's going on for us internally. And also throughout scripture, we know there are several references just to being still and to being peace. But Psalms 46:10 specifically says, "Be still and know that I am God." Our faith is so important when we're trying to manage our stressors, when we're trying to manage our mental health. And we have to remember that everything that we experience is not personal. Everything that we experience is not about us. But even in those things, there is a lesson that we can learn. And we also have to make sure that we are not centering our lives around ourselves because we will be disappointed, or centering our lives around another person because we know that person will also disappoint us. And so in being still and focusing on God, that also reassures that God is the center of our life and He does not change. He is the only thing that's constant. We change. And so it's important for us just to make sure too that we have God as a focal point in helping us. Thank you all so much for joining me on this episode of Heal with KP. I appreciate you following along my series, The Intro to Healing, and today's episode, Healing 101. I hope today has provided you with a deeper understanding on emotional healing and the importance of healing overall. Remember that healing is a journey that takes time. Please remember to be patient with yourself and have faith that healing is possible. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with somebody who could benefit from it. And don't forget to subscribe and drop any questions below that you might have pertaining to healing or anything I mentioned in this episode. Join me next week as we dive into the different stages of healing and how to navigate each step with faith and resilience. Be on the lookout for a PDF. I want to give a PDF recap of today's podcast that you can easily apply into your day-to-day life. And that's all I have for you all on today. Keep healing, and I'll see you next time.